So back again, a Big Bang, 15 or 14 or 13 billion years, nothing happened until the sun came, nothing happened until the earth came, and then life started about 3.8 billion years ago, and there you are back close to this place, and the red dot alone extended here 100 million years, and here we are humans. So from here we are looking back at life over all this period and all this period, and that's our heritage. This is the fossil I showed you. This fossil from Sriperumbutur, this fossil from Sriperumbutur here, they all were there in India when India was part of Antarctica, Australia, Africa, South America. If you go there, you will find the same fossil plant in these places. Earth has been moving. It's still moving. A little guy who broke open one of these fossils for me, and this plant which you can see, cycas plant, which is growing today, is the closest relative of this plant. And this one, a different species that went extinct that is still living. It's almost like a living fossil. There had been 5 major extinctions during the 3.8 billion years of life. Not one flood that destroyed everything. 95% of all the species that ever lived on the earth have gone extinct. And today we have this number of species living, and all the species are extinct. And this number of species living is estimated to be about 30 million or so. It can be more, it can be less, because scientists are still trying to determine. The rapid development, as far as we can judge, of all the higher plants with recent geological time is an abominable mystery. The origin of the flowering plant for Darwin was an abominable mystery. That mystery is still being solved, not completely solved. Botanists now have some idea of where the flowering plants might have originated about 200 million years ago, what it might have looked, and I won't show that all now. But this picture, which is a Tamil heritage picture, Kondrai Poo, this was photographed 2 years ago in Florida, near the Miami Botanical Garden. They have in the botanical garden of the Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden practically every plant tropical that you can think of, every mango variety that you can think of. We have Thari Panai that are blooming now, and I had to write to the curator there, do you have Corypha thaliara in your garden? And he writes me back, we have 3 specimens of Corypha thaliara. Corypha thaliara was an Indian species extinct in the wild. There is supposed to be one growing now in Bangladesh, Dhaka Garden. Otherwise, it is there growing in Florida National Garden. This is a picture, again, it's a beautiful picture that a friend gives me permission to use last universal common ancestor and everything that is living today. And you can go back in time when from a common ancestor the green algae might have grown and when the plants might have grown. You can go down to an earlier period when from a common ancestor animals went and then fungi went. Animals are more closely related to fungi than fungi are related to plants. We usually study in a botany department fungi thinking it's closely related. But the DNA studies now show that they are a distinct group. You can construct a tree like this, a complicated tree based on biochemistry, morphology, anatomy, DNA analysis to show which is related to whom, which is related to whom. But all these trees must go back to these trees. And the first tree like this was constructed by Darwin. Darwin constructed this tree in one of his notes, and he said, these are branches of things that are living today, and these are extinct. And he said, I'd rather call this not a tree, but a coral of living, of life. And then he constructed another tree, a very famous tree. And then this is the only picture that he used in his book, again showing how organism might have evolved. I probably have another picture and I'll show that to you. Here is the one. People are now using this to make necklaces. He said, the case must be that B and C are closely related than B related to A. This is the tree. You can't imagine that 160, 170 years ago, a man making a tree, which is today the very basis of explaining all kinds of phylogenetic relationship of every organism, including bacteria, fungi, and human beings. This is the only image that he used in his book, and he said, well, B, C, and D might have been living, but then they extinct. They died off. They did not give a future life. But here are A, and that branched out, and out of that probably some still are living. And he drew these horizontal lines, and he said, what would be the time scale between here and here? 10,000? He said, the longer it will be better. The more time you have given, it's easier to fit my theory of evolution. Because it also fits with Lyell's idea of geological formation, and that's what we know today. The fossil that I showed you is 200 million years old. Here is the leaf with the chloroplast and the mitochondria, which were once upon a time bacterium, using the light to make food. And here is the female of the Minminipoochie. And at night time, this is Madras Christian College campuses, some of these things still, fortunately. One night I took this and put it on a piece of paper. I can read from the light coming out of this gland the letters. What is this light? We call this bioluminescence. The bioluminescence light comes because of a chemical reaction that's going on there, but that light is actually sunlight, and that's why we celebrate Pongal. The light of the sun runs all living things on the earth. Here the common one, a butterfly and its pupa and larva, and this is your nerium plant. And this female plant knows exactly to lay only on the nerium plant and not any other plant. And Darwin would say that's what selection did. How this recognized that plant is part of the selection process. This plant is poisonous. There are some people who commit suicide by grinding the seed and eating it. But that poison becomes part of this pupa and caterpillar, so birds won't eat it. The male of this goes to a different plant and scratches the leaf and gets an alkaloid called pyrrolizidine alkaloid and uses this alkaloid to spray in the air as a sexual pheromone to attract the female. All these complex things that's going on can all still be explained by Darwin's theory. And if you look at the antenna of this butterfly, this is antenna from a Madras Christian College. I took it to the US one time. This is a segment of 30 different segments that make up a long antenna. And if you look closely at one of the antenna, in one of the dots, you see an organ like this. There are many such organs. Some recognize moisture, some recognize carbon dioxide, some recognize the chemical. And Darwin used to say, if you look at the complexity of this organism, what it can do, it's more than what human mind can do. There are some areas where we excel, but there are other areas where insect behavior is even more excellent. You have basmati rice, and that's a chemical called 2-acetylpyrroline, and that's what comes out when you cook basmati rice. And so you know your mother is cooking there, and sitting here, you know basmati rice is getting ready. What is this chemical? That chemical is in the urine of the male tiger. It's a sexual pheromone for the tiger. So the tiger goes and uses this in order to attract the mate. How come in evolution one chemical got used? Or are we as human beings, with our very, very ancient past memory that goes back to the tiger days, still using this and thinking that we are eating this as a food, but actually it's your sexual stimulant? You see this also in another plant. This plant is grows in some of the houses, and in Thailand people use this. This is not rice, but if you pluck this green leaf and put it in the ordinary rice and cook, your ordinary rice will turn back into basmati rice because the same chemical is there. Darwin had many pigeons. He liked to breed pigeons in his house. This is supposed to be the wild pigeon. And these are all the different kinds of pigeons that were around in England at that time. He said, if human beings can produce so many true breeding pigeons out of one pigeon, why can't nature select and produce all kinds of species? We do this in 200 years, just give 200 million years for nature to do the selection process. So human selection was superimposed. The same way we selected chili. The chili plant is a South American plant. 300 to 400 years ago, there was no place in India where anybody was using chili for cooking or making a pickle, chili pickle. This was introduced by the Portuguese. But the moment it came, anywhere in the world, people started developing all kinds of varieties. They are all true breeding varieties. So the seed of this will only give you this. People can select plants or animals. This guy says, am I related to other life? These guys say we are truly related to other life. And in the book that Darwin wrote on origin of species, he had only this line: much light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. He knew human beings also evolved in the same process that all other living things. But he didn't want to upset. He wanted people to read his book first. And he waited for a while. And then he wrote a book soon after his friend Thomas Huxley forced him to write. Thomas Huxley was strongest supporter of Darwin. And he wrote a book called Man's Place in Nature. He discussed the anatomy of human beings and compared with the anatomy of other animals also. And then said, Darwin, you simply cannot wait. You have to come up with your theory. Because Darwin had already worked out his theory. And Darwin published his work based on the relationship between embryological things. Here is a human embryo and here is a fish embryo. Why would they all look similar? Why would you have gills as human beings, the gills that fish have? They are functional when they mature, but this disappears in the very early stages of babyhood. Why would there be brain structure which is similar in all these organisms? Looking at all these organisms, Darwin published finally The Descent of Man in 1871, that humans too evolved from common ancestors. It's a 2-volume book. Darwin's idea was that humans must have evolved from a common ancestral group, not directly from one monkey or one ape, but a group of organisms that were definitely prior and more primitive, and which one they could be. Among the higher apes that are living today on Earth, which includes orangutan, gorilla, and chimpanzee, orangutan is here. Chimpanzee and gorilla is here. And Darwin knew that the closest anatomical and behavioral other organism of all this is chimpanzee. So he said, if you want to look for human origins, you go back to Africa. Darwin himself, therefore, was telling, my progenitors came from Africa. And my progenitors came probably from a primate group. It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes, closely allied to the gorillas and chimpanzees. And as these two species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived in African continent than elsewhere. It takes a brilliant mind in 1870s to predict that he and his ancestors, living in England, white man, rich, powerful nation, is saying that he came from Africa and he came from ape-like creatures. Today we know that we are very closely related to chimpanzee, and there was some common ancestor. And we also know how these all other primates are linked and how long can we go back in time when the common ancestors might have been. In one of the lectures I also said you are related to the chimpanzee as well as to the neem tree, and that's also true. We are related to the neem tree, except you have to go back way down to see in the phylogenetic tree. Darwin also wrote, among other books, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This is not happy, this ape, and this is very happy after you gave food. He commissioned photographs of expressions of human beings. This appeared in this book. There are several plates in that book, and said all these expressions can also be traced back to the animal world. And nothing here in human expression is unique to human beings. Now we know that cousin chimp is our closest non-human relative. The only difference in DNA between chimpanzee and us, only 2%, 1.98% or so. I always tell my students, next time when you go to Vandalur Zoo, the first relative that you want to see is the chimpanzee before you see all other relatives. People have now identified genes, what is called the human accelerated gene in all organisms, including chicken and chimpanzee and human beings. There has been rapid changes. It's the same sequence, but rapid changes that are taking place now as we are evolving. One of the professors, two of the professors, many of my botany professors are here, there. 92% of the mouse gene is similar to us. 90% to chimp, 18% to plants, and 500 genes shared with all living things. Some people, of course, were upset because they thought of human beings as a super creature, directly created in the image of God, endowed with qualities that are so noble compared to the animal world, and they could not possibly stomach that we evolved from ape-like ancestors. So they tried to caricature, but that was a small group and sometimes a religious group. By and large, there was acceptance. At the time of Darwin, there were not many human fossils. Just one or two. There was one Homo erectus skull that was known, not many. Darwin said, you must go to Africa, and the human evolution must have been very rapid, he said. And that's the reason why he thought there were not many fossil things available. But when they went to Africa, especially the Leakey family, they started finding enormous number of ancestral species, other than apes, more closely related to human beings. The computer technology now can put flesh on these skulls and try to create how our ancestors might have looked like. What happened was, from the ape-like quadruped four thing, we had a bipedal revolution. And that bipedal revolution occurred probably about 3.5 million years ago. When that occurred, we became taller and more intimidating to the predators which would be coming to otherwise eat when we were walking like this. Walking on two legs is more efficient in terms of calories used. We are able to use our front legs to use tools and hunt and gather more efficiently. We expose less of our bodies to direct sunlight, allowing for more efficient cooling. Otherwise, like dog, we'll have to be putting our tongues out. So standing up had its advantages, but it had its disadvantages. Here you are, and the heart is here supplying blood to your brain and blood to your back, but now you are standing up, the heart has to pump blood up, a difficult process because you are working against gravity now. Here you are, all your stomach organs sitting here, but now you are standing up, it is pressing down, so you have hernia problem. Here you are, blood goes up easily, but it has to take much effort to go up there. So many of the human problems and illness that we are still stuck with has to do with being bipedal, backbone problem, for example. But then evolution never said you will be perfect. Evolution is not perfect. It was not meant to be perfect. It simply evolves, and over a period things happen. This is one of the earliest of our ancestors, Australopithecus, 3.3 million years ago, that was able to stand erect. Not only did they find the skull and the bones of this, they also found footprints of this. Not only they found the footprints by Leakey and their group, they were such powerful anthropology scientists, they said this is a woman's footprint. With that, they can say how tall she would have been. what gait she would have had. Not only did they find that, they also found a child's footprint there. You can now build a story. Maybe the mother was holding the child while she was walking. Not only did they find this, they also found a guinea fowl, a chicken going there. So 3.5 million year old footprints have been preserved that people can now excavate and study. That's also fossil, just like a human fossil. Then you have Homo erectus, one of our close relatives, standing up. And there is a footprint of this, not unlike ours. The moment we had bipedalism and our hands were free, we were able to make tools. And it's the ability to make tools and design tools that made rapid development of your brain and neuronal connection. Because what's involved in making a tool? You look at a tool which looks like a spherical structure. You have to imagine, oh, I'm going to take this, I'm going to chip this. So you need something else to chip that. So you already know what you are going to create. And what you are going to create is what you will be using for hunting and gathering. This is the oldest that was known until a few years ago, 2.6 million year old stone tool. Now they found one that is even 3.3 million year old. So Australopithecus itself was using the tools. I won't go into all these details. Now we have a fairly good story. It gets minor corrections here and there as scientists find out more and more of the time period since 6 million years ago until the origin of Homo sapiens, where it occurred, what kind of tools that they used, where do we find. So what happened? The final story, therefore, would be that from Africa, some species moved out, the green one, to India. Other species moved out here in Europe. And finally, our species, Homo sapiens, moved out on top of that. So the stone axis that I showed you from Atrambakkam is what is green. Homo erectus came here and used the stone and disappeared. And then Homo sapiens came, and it's the Homo sapiens who are now ruling the world. This is the stone axis that was first found by Robert Bruce Foote, an axe in Pallavaram, and a cleaver in Atrambakkam near Pundi. They are supposed to be 1.5 million years old. There is some doubt about the age, but one of our own Madras archaeologists, a lady, has been dating this now. Even if it is 1 million, here was a species other than Homo sapiens which was using these tools. I went there with a friend of mine. You can collect. You can go there. You can see hundreds of this stone on the surface even today near Pundi. Human beings today who came out of Africa would have been somewhat similar in their character and color and stature. But after they came out, you begin to see the variation. This is all part of our heritage that goes back to maybe 60,000, 70,000 years ago. You are not what you think you are, we already said. But now there is another story to this. If you want to study your chromosome and the DNA in your chromosome, and you can use this to date your ancestry, you can also study the DNA in the mitochondrion. After all, the mitochondrion was a bacterium that came into you. It had its own DNA. If you are studying a plant, of course, you can study the plant DNA. The botanists do that. But by studying the DNA in the nucleus or in the mitochondria, now we are able to trace more history than we can. Why? This is a human egg, actual egg. And see how large that is compared to the sperms that are roaming around it. Part of the human egg and the sperm. Inside the human egg is 1/2 the chromosome number of a normal human being like me. The other half of the chromosome number is brought by the sperm, and they join together. Some of the sperms bring what we call as a Y chromosome. Some of them don't have the Y chromosome, they bring an X chromosome. Depending upon what chromosome they bring to the egg, and the fertilized egg produces either a woman or a male or a female child. Those sperms which carry Y chromosome, when they fertilize an egg, they produce a male child. So if you can study the Y chromosome DNA, you can trace your ancestry back all the way through the mutations that are found in the Y chromosome. If you study the DNA of the mitochondrion, which Amma has, you can study the ancestry of your mother. I have mitochondria in my body, but I did not get it from my father. My father's sperm was too small to carry a mitochondrion. I got my mitochondrion from my mother because her egg was fairly big. All of you have your mitochondrion that came from your mother. And all the men here got your Y chromosome that came to your father. And all the women here don't have a Y chromosome. You cannot trace your ancestry through the Y chromosome. Now the technology is so advanced that some of these people who have studied the mitochondria of the people all around the world say that there was a woman in Africa probably 200,000 years ago. Some say maybe you have to push it back to 300,000 years ago. One woman where all our mitochondrial DNA go and coalesce. This possibly could be the woman from which all the human beings we are living on the earth might have evolved. They give the various names because this was discovered there. They gave the name African Eve. But some said, no, don't use the Eve because there's a Christian implication to that. So you call that as a mitochondrial Eve and things like that. 7 billion people now living. 140 billion people dead since we became human species. And all the 7 billion species can trace their ancestry back probably to that one woman, or maybe a few women, even if there are some changes in scientific advancement. 100,000 years ago, there were no people in India. You cannot talk of any heritage in India. You cannot talk of any heritage in South America or North America, any place else. The only place where there was some heritage was in Africa at that time. And then all human cognitive skills already developed in Africa before they moved out of Africa. The cognitive skills is what we call brain-based, the ability to think, read, learn, remember, reason, pay attention, and communicate. And Darwin already wrote in his book, intellectual ability by selection made the most dominant animal humans. And he said, selection made it possible for human people to observe and have memory, have curiosity and imagination, reason. These are exactly Darwin's words. 150 years ago, he was already writing where we got our ability. And that's why our heritage says, Yadumore, Yavaram Kalir. It's not just for people in India, it's for people in Africa, it's for people anywhere else. Whether the man who wrote this in Sangam period meant this or not, the implication is certainly there. All of us are also equally endowed. Color may be politics, but then we have now ability to trace how long can you go and find out this politics. This politics of color may be maximum 60,000 years. Because people left Africa only about 60,000 to 80,000 or maybe 90,000 years ago. Before they left, all human beings were dark in color in Africa. So every other color and variation that happened in the last 60, 70,000 years ago. We can put politics into that, we can put hierarchy into this and all that, but this is how we now look at history. 8,000 years ago, Europeans were dark-skinned. That's what their genes show. Not Indo-European speakers. 80,000 years ago, people living in England were not Indo-European speakers. That language moved at a later time, 4,500 years ago. That color change happened at a later time. Darwin's evolutionary theory was misused. Anybody can use any misused theory. Sometimes thinking rightly interpreted, something definitely knowing that they are interpreting it wrong in order for their selfish reasons. So that's how the idea called eugenics. Why can't we improve the human beings then? If genes control your character and there are some good genes, something that make you better, why can't we improve the human race? That's what gave rise to racism. That's what gave rise to Nazism. One of the interesting things was that people traced the DNA of Hitler. One of Hitler's descendant is in New York. And when this guy went to a hotel and ate food and used the napkin to wipe his mouth and left, they took the napkin away. And then they extracted the DNA from that. And when you study the DNA, this is a man, Y DNA trace, it shows that he has Jewish ancestry in there. So here was a man killing the Jews, thinking they are an inferior race or somebody that they must subjugate. But in reality, he himself has a genetic basis with them. Charles Darwin was very clear. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change in that particular environment. He was very clear about ideas that were evolving even during his period. How I should like to see the greatest curse on earth, slavery, abolished. His grandfather was abolitionist. They made plates, anti-slavery plates, and shipped it to the US. Darwin said 1 million horrid deaths is okay if that can abolish slavery. Greatest genetic diversity in the world is in Africa, because that's where people originated.